So I had the opportunity to sit down with Secretary Ben Carson yesterday, and I asked him in the middle of this interview, which was wide-ranging, I said, hey, how are you going to make sure that people are going to be able to make rent after the eviction moratorium is over? Moratorium's great, but people are not getting evicted, but eventually the bill comes due. This is what he had to say. Let's take a listen. Eventually, rent will come due for many of these people, and many of them are experiencing permanent job loss. How are Americans supposed to be able to make that eventual rent whenever it does come due?
Well, what people have to recognize is it's always best to go to the source of the problem rather than to put Band-Aids on things. And what is the source of this problem? The source of the problem is this pandemic. Before the pandemic occurred, as you probably know, home ownership was increasing quite substantially in some communities like the African American community. The wealth gap was shrinking, unemployment at the lowest levels ever. The economy was extremely strong, and that's the only reason that it's been able to withstand 5 months of shutdown. But that can't last forever, as you point out. Mm-hmm. And that's why you have to go to the source. What is the source? It is the pandemic and the fear of the pandemic. And that's why so much effort is being placed on coming up with a cure, coming up with a vaccine that is actually effective, because the fear of the virus is every bit as devastating as the virus itself, if not more so.
Fear of the virus, Krystal.
200,000 people are dead from the virus.
Well, actually,
I would say
my response was, some people should be afraid.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we had 21 or 22 states now where the virus is resurgent and rising. You've got 200,000 Americans. I think there's plenty legitimately to be afraid of the virus. But also, it's so classic. In a way, he's right. The source of the problem obviously is the pandemic, which is no one's fault, right? It's not the fault it's the fault of some political leadership that it got out of control, but it's no individual's fault that the pandemic has been so destructive to the country and to the economy. But he doesn't offer any we're going to help them in this way, and we're going to make sure that they're okay in this way. Or, just even if you were sort of vague and didn't have a specific answer, but we're going to make sure that that Americans do not become homeless because of an unavoidable pandemic.
I don't know why you can't just say that.
Right, exactly. Instead, it's the problem is the fear of the pandemic. If people would just stop being afraid, we'd all be good to go.
If people were afraid, then people would spend money. This is classic libertarianism. It's like libertarian brain, which is that these people are marching all through Washington, and they're like, oh, well, the problem is that people are afraid of the virus, and so that means that people need to go back to work, and then when people go back to work, to be able to pay their rent. Really? How many people were actually able to make rent on a consistent basis before the pandemic? Now ask yourself, how many of them are going to be able to make 6 months of back rent or 3 months of back rent? Could you? Could any of you? Could you make 3 months of back rent? That's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
How are you? That could take years to save for some people.
Absolutely.
And again, they won't. There's not even an acknowledgement of the pain. That's what drove me crazy whenever I asked them that. And you can just see, which is it's a tragedy. But, they'll think of it as natural business cycle. People will go out there. Some will fail. Some might not. And it's just, look, I think millions of people are going to go homeless within the next 5-10 years. And this is exactly why. It won't start once. It'll just keep going and going and going. But the moratorium is going to expire eventually. I don't think Joe Biden's going to do anything about it. I don't think the Trump administration is going to do anything about it.
Nope.
And this is what's going to happen. It's going to be 2008 all over again for lower middle class Americans. And they're just going to have even less wealth than whenever they had no wealth to begin with.
We're month or two, couple of news cycles away from it now being the fault of the people themselves. That's the way it always shifts. It never falls. The accountability never falls on political leadership, never falls on any elites, never falls on any bankers. It's never their fault. It's always the fault of the individual struggling Americans, that they didn't have enough personal responsibility or stick-to-itness or grit or whatever. And it's obviously that's absurd given what we've experienced over the past year, but don't think that absurdity will keep them from insisting that it is those people's fault and blaming them. We saw this in the foreclosure crisis. We saw this in the housing crisis. It turned into this it's your fault, struggling homeowner, and so we're not going to do anything about it. We're going to bail out the banks and leave you high and dry and let your home get foreclosed on, your life destroyed.
Yeah, that's what it is. And you can see right there, that's the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. not a lot's coming for you.
All right, we're going to have more rising for you after this.